It was one of those nights where everything felt too quiet, the kind of silence that made you feel like the world had forgotten you and you were left alone to face whatever lurked in the shadows. I sat in my small apartment, the only light coming from the flickering lamp on my nightstand. The power had gone out an hour ago, but I wasn't too worried. I had my phone, though its battery was already low. I kept telling myself the lights would come back on any minute, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The wind outside howled, and the rain tapped against the window like fingers impatiently drumming on glass. I glanced at the clock. It was just after midnight. I should have been asleep by now, but something kept me awake. A feeling, a sense that I wasn't alone. I got up from my bed and walked to the window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, and from where I stood I could see the empty street below. No cars, no people, just the occasional rustling of leaves blown by the wind. But then, as I scanned the street, I saw something. A figure stood in the distance, right under the street lamp. It was hard to make out, but it seemed to be a person, standing perfectly still. I squinted, trying to get a better look. Who would be out at this time in this weather? The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring up at my window, though I couldn't see its face. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. It was probably nothing, a trick of the light, I told myself. But then, the tapping started. At first, I thought it was the rain again, but it wasn't. This was different. It was coming from inside the apartment. I froze, listening carefully. Tap, tap, tap. I turned toward the door. The sound was coming from the other side, like someone or something was tapping their fingers on the wood. Slowly, I walked toward it, my footsteps barely making a sound on the cold floor. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I paused. The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was silent again. The only sound was the wind outside. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The hallway outside was empty, as it always was. I let out a shaky laugh. I was being paranoid. The storm, the darkness, it was all messing with my head. I turned back into my room, but before I could close the door, a loud bang echoed from the hallway. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The door at the end of the hall, the one that led to the stairwell, was wide open. It had been closed just moments ago. I was sure of it. I stared down the dark corridor, my eyes trying to adjust to the shadows. For a long time, nothing moved. Then, from the darkness of the stairwell, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming closer. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. My back pressed against the door, I listened as the footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside my apartment. The tapping began again. Whoever or whatever it was, they were right outside. I didn't dare move. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. Call for help? Run? Hide? Then I heard something else. It was faint, but unmistakable. A whisper, low and scratchy, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of gravel. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were meant for me. The tapping continued, growing more insistent, louder, harder. My chest tightened, and I backed away from the door, my eyes wide with fear. The whispering grew louder too, more frantic, like it was pleading with me. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my fingers fumbling to unlock it. The battery was at 2%. I dialed the emergency number, praying it would go through before my phone died. But before I could hit call, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was suffocating. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my eyes locked on the door, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I dropped the phone and backed up until I hit the wall. The knob twisted, and the door creaked open, just a crack. A sliver of darkness spilled into the room, and from that darkness, a pale hand reached inside. It was thin and bony, with long, sharp fingers that scraped against the doorframe as it pushed the door open wider. My breath caught in my throat as the hand reached out toward me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The hand withdrew, and the door closed with a soft click. For a long time, I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I listened, But there were no more footsteps, no more tapping, just the sound of the rain against the window. I collapsed onto the floor, my whole body shaking. I didn't know what had just happened, and I didn't want to find out. All I knew was that something had been there, something that wasn't human, and it wasn't done with me yet. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep, didn't move from my spot on the floor. When the sun finally rose, I gathered the little courage I had left and packed a bag. I couldn't stay here, not after what had happened. As I left the apartment, I glanced down the hallway toward the stairwell. The door was closed, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I don't know where I'll go, but I won't stay in the dead of night again. Not after what I saw. I never believed in ghosts, or anything supernatural really. That changed one night, when I was staying at my cousin's old farmhouse for the weekend. The place was ancient, built over 100 years ago, and creaked like it had its own voice. It was late, probably around 2 a.m. The wind outside was picking up, making the trees sway and cast strange shadows on the walls. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Something about the house made me feel uneasy, but I couldn't explain why. Suddenly I heard it, a faint whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too clear. It sounded like a voice, low and scratchy, coming from just outside the bedroom door. I sat up, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, hoping it was just my cousin playing a prank on me. But there was no answer. Just the sound of the whispering continuing, like a conversation I couldn't quite understand. I hesitated for a moment, then threw the covers off and crept toward the door. The whispering grew louder as I got closer. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my breath shaky. I had to know what it was, even though every part of me was screaming to stay in bed. Slowly, I opened the door, peeking into the hallway. It was dark, but I could just make out the outline of the old furniture and the staircase leading down to the first floor. The whispering had stopped. Everything was dead silent. I stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my weight. My eyes scanned the darkness, trying to make sense of what I had heard. And then, just as I was about to turn back into the room, I saw something at the end of the hallway. A figure. It was standing there, barely visible in the shadows, but I could see its outline. It was tall, thin, and seemed to be wearing some kind of old, tattered clothing. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. The whispers started again. They were coming from the figure now, soft and urgent, but still impossible to understand. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring at it, trying to figure out if this was real or if I was dreaming. The figure took a step forward. That's when I snapped out of it. I turned and bolted back into the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I backed up until I hit the bed and sat down, trying to calm myself. For a few minutes, everything was silent again. But then, there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocks came again, louder this time, and then the whispering started up once more, right outside the door. I could hear the floorboards creaking as something, or someone, moved in the hallway. It paced back and forth in front of the door, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to seep through, filling my head. It felt like it was inside my mind, not just outside the door. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was so intense it was almost deafening. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was nothing. No whispers, no creaking floorboards, nothing. When the sun finally rose, I cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty. The figure was gone, and everything looked exactly as it had the night before. I left that house as fast as I could. I don't know what I heard or what I saw, but I know it wasn't something natural. And I'll never stay there again, not after the whispers in the dark. It was a cold, quiet night, and I was walking home from a late shift at the diner. The streets were mostly empty, except for a few cars passing by every now and then. The streetlights flickered as I made my way down the familiar route. I usually felt safe walking home, but something about that night felt different. The air was thick, and there was a strange sense of unease that I couldn't shake, I had just turned onto the final street leading to my apartment when I noticed him. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as I walked closer, I realized there was a man standing in the alley ahead, just outside the reach of the streetlight. He was tall, wearing a long coat that looked out of place for the time of year, and his face was hidden in the shadows. I hesitated, slowing my steps as I tried to figure out what to do. The alley was narrow, a shortcut I usually took when I was in a hurry, but something about the way he stood there, so still and quiet, made my skin crawl. I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see his face. I quickly decided to keep walking straight, past the alley. My heartbeat quickened as I got closer, and I forced myself not to look directly at him, though it took every bit of willpower I had. I was just a few feet from the alley's edge when I heard it. A soft, raspy voice. "Hey!" I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't a friendly hey. It was slow, drawn out, and filled with something I couldn't quite place, something wrong. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance in his direction. He had taken a step forward, but his face was still hidden in the shadows. The light from the street lamp didn't seem to touch him, as if the darkness around him was thicker, heavier. "Hey," he said again, a little louder this time. "You lost?" I shook my head quickly, not trusting myself to speak. My mouth had gone dry, and a deep sense of dread was building in my stomach. Something told me to move, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. "I can help you," the man said, stepping closer to the mouth of the alley. Now, I could see his face, or what should have been his face. There was something off about it. His features seemed blurred, like they didn't quite fit together right. His eyes, dark and empty, locked onto mine. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "No, I'm fine," I finally managed to mutter, my voice barely a whisper. I turned away from him and started walking, faster now, desperate to put distance between us. But the sound of his footsteps followed. They were slow at first, but as I quickened my pace, so did he. I could hear the steady thud of his boots hitting the pavement behind me, and I didn't dare look back. My mind raced with thoughts of what he wanted, who or what he really was. I broke into a run, the cold air burning my lungs as I sprinted toward my apartment. The footsteps behind me grew louder, faster. I could hear his breathing now, raspy and uneven, like he was right behind me. My building was just ahead, but it felt miles away. I pushed myself harder, the sound of his pursuit closing in. Finally, I reached the front door and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. The footsteps stopped. I froze, my key halfway into the door. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The street was empty. There was no sign of the man, no sign of anyone at all. The alley was dark and still, as if nothing had ever been there. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for him to reappear. But he didn't. The street was quiet again, the only sound the faint hum of the streetlights above. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and rushed inside, locking it tightly behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I never saw the man in the alley again, but sometimes, late at night when I'm walking home alone, I can still hear those footsteps behind me. And I know, deep down, that he's still out there, waiting, watching,